Welcome, Gunrunner.
The glory days of the video game arcade might be a long way behind us, sadly, but they certainly haven't been forgotten. And in this video I'm going to take you back over 30 years to those heady days that played such an important part in our youth. The year is 1989, and we are all present at one of the greatest times in coin-op video game history. You won't find any fruit machines, penny pushers or fixed prize machines here. These are the true arcade classics that lit up dingy smoke-filled rooms, sat on stained carpets, and delighted audiences while they drained our pockets of all our spare change. Names like Sega, Konami, Capcom, Taito and Atari have all become synonymous with gaming, and so it will be no surprise to see them feature heavily in this video. This is where many of today's popular franchises started, multiple innovations took place, and the genres that we know and love today were formed. All of these titles play every bit as well today as they did back then, and deserve to be remembered as true classics in the annals of video game history. There's no doubting that 1989 was a truly great year for arcade games. I could have easily doubled the number of games on this list, in fact, and is one that includes more than its fair share of all-time classics. But the one thing that really struck me about this year was the sheer variation of different games that we got to experience. I can't think of another year that I've covered so far that features so many different genres. We have shoot 'em ups, puzzle games, beat 'em ups, run and guns, sports games, platformers, racing games, you name it, 1989 has it. So I'm sure there's going to be a coin op for everyone here as we take a closer look at the greatest arcade games of 1989. Badlands really stood out in the arcades thanks to its huge multiplayer cabinet form that came complete with 3 steering wheels and represents the very last game in Atari's classic Sprint series. This game makes a number of changes and enhancements over its more famous predecessor Super Sprint. Firstly, and most obviously, Badlands is set in a post-apocalyptic future rather than the more traditional Formula 1 stylings of its prequels. Perhaps the most notable addition, however, is the bolt-on weapons that can be used to take out your opponents in the most violent fashion imaginable. Based on a Japanese manga called Tenchi wo Kurao and a reenactment of the battle between the Kingdom of Shu and the Yellow Turban Rebels, Dynasty Wars is a 2-player game where you can each assume the role of one of 4 Chinese generals riding on horseback from the Three Kingdoms period in an attempt to smash the rebellion and defeat the Huang Xing. Although it's essentially a rather unique horse riding scrolling beat 'em up, Dynasty Wars also contains a few RPG elements too, as you must level up your characters and gain experience points through combat. Uzznick is a really strange puzzle game that takes quite a bit of getting used to, but when you do, it's really addictive. It actually plays a little bit like a cross between 2 other popular puzzlers in Soccer and Columns, if you can imagine that. But it's very much its own game with lots of originality. On each screen you have a group of blocks that are dropped into an enclosed space around you. From here you have to move these blocks around to make them match without leaving any behind. What makes this difficult is you are restricted in where you can move the blocks to, because of the limited space. Data East's Midnight Resistance is an excellent run and gun set in a dystopian future where the player assumes the role of a resistance movement soldier who goes on a mission to rescue his kidnapped family from an evil drugs kingpin. The main gimmick here is the inclusion of a rotating joystick, similar to the one used in Ikari Warriors, in addition to the traditional set of shoot and jump buttons. This allows the player to keep their aim in one direction whilst moving in another, even whilst crawling or jumping, and gives the game a real point of difference over similar titles like Capcom's Contra. Probably Capcom's most famous and popular side-scrolling shoot-em-up, UN Squadron was originally known as Area 88 in Japan and based on a manga series of the same name. But being pretty unknown to Western gamers, the name of the game was changed to something with a bit more international flavour. The key feature of UN Squadron is that you're able to choose between 3 different pilots, each with their own different plane and characteristics, which is something you don't usually see in shoot 'em ups of this type, and gives it a real point of difference over its rivals. Amazingly, it took 3 years for Sega to follow up on the success of Outrun. Considering how popular the original game was, you would have thought they would have done it much sooner. In Turbo Outrun, the idea is to race across America within a time limit, as opposed to the multiple paths of the original. The Testarossa has been traded in for another even faster Ferrari in the form of the F40, which is equipped with a very useful turbo. Although Turbo Outrun is certainly more impressive from a technical standpoint, the actual game never quite manages to capture the magic of the original. Pang is a highly original game for 1 or 2 players, where you use a harpoon to shoot bubbles that bounce around the screen. When you hit a bubble, it bursts into smaller bubbles that are much harder to hit and avoid, just like asteroids. Many of the levels feature platforms that either get in the way or can be used to your advantage by climbing ladders to reach different parts of the screen. There are also power-ups that can be collected to give you things like multiple shots, freeze, dynamite, and rope hooks that keep your stream in place until something hits it. Pang is a great multiplayer blast. When people think of arcade basketball games, then they usually mention NBA Jam. But before that hugely popular slam dunker, there was Midway's arch rivals. Designed by Brian Rampage Collin, this game is widely regarded as starting the whole sports game cross with violence craze of the early 90s. In essence, Arch Rivals is basically a 2-on-2 full-court basketball game, but the removal of normal rules makes the experience very different to any previous basketball games. So as well as passing, shooting and dunking, you also have punching, shoving and even pulling down pants. I'm sure that most of you already know this, but Shadow Dancer is the sequel to Sega's hugely popular Shinobi, and the only other arcade game in the franchise. The gameplay is mostly the same here, with you controlling a ninja master as he walks through the side-scrolling levels, defeating the bad guys, using a combination of punches and kicks, weapons, and of course the special ninja magic. But the big change here is that you are now joined by a faithful canine known as Shadow. This dog will aid you on your mission to defeat the terrorists and save the city before their bombs are detonated. Capcom's epic arcade adventure Strider set the arcades alight on release, wowing audience with its beautiful backdrops and stunning animation. Set in a dystopian future in the year 2048, where a mysterious dictator known as the Grand Master rules over the world, you are Hiryu, the youngest ever Super A-ranked member of the organisation of high-tech ninja agents known as the Striders. He alone is tasked with the Grand Master's assassination and begins his mission by infiltrating his base in the Kazakh Soviet Socialist Republic, flipping, rolling, sliding, swinging and slashing as he goes. The prequel to the legendary WWF WrestleFest arcade game, WWF Superstars, was arguably the first wrestling game to truly bring the spectacle of the real thing into the pixel world. It featured 6 playable characters in Hulk Hogan, Macho Man Randy Savage, The Ultimate Warrior, Hacksaw Jim Duggan, Big Boss Man and the Honky Tonk Man, who you used to form a tag team and ultimately challenge the Mega Bucks, $1 Million Man Ted DiBiase and Andre the Giant in the Tokyo Dome for the tag team titles. It might lack a few features, but there's no doubting its influence on what followed. Sly Spy is clearly inspired by James Bond, and it's basically just a 007 game in all but name, with an all-American theme shoehorned in. In fact, it's actually quite surprising that they didn't get sued, but I'm very pleased that they didn't, because Sly Spy has always been a real favourite of mine. One of the things I love most about this game is how every level is different to the last, giving lots of variation to the gameplay. From the first level where you're falling from the sky with a parachute, to the stage where you race along the streets on a motorbike, and the final shootout itself. Possibly gaining the award for the longest title in gaming history, thankfully the gameplay is not as complex as all rating it. In Robot Monsters, you take control of one of 2 space captains, the macho named Jake and Duke, and then run around the xeno-infested planet in question trying to save your buddies. Blast aliens, collect items, rescue comrades, solve puzzles, and then beam to the next level, and that's pretty much all there is to it. Well, not quite. The ultimate goal of the game is to rescue your associate Dr. Cerebellum from Planet X, where her research facility has been taken over by these evil reptilians. The basic plot of Toki involves some evil wizard turning a prince into an ape, and then stealing away his princess and locking her in his castle. You control our heroic primate as he tries to make his way through the levels, defeat all the baddies, and eventually rescue from the wizard's clutches. Although Toki is a platformer at heart, it does have some run and gun style elements. You can spit fireballs at your enemies to kill them, as well as jump on their heads to stun them, with each having a distinct advantage. There aren't that many truly great arcade originating platformers out there, so Toki is a definite standout. Endorsed by some bloke called Ivan Iron Man Stewart, whose image adorned all the arcade cabinets, in many ways Super Offroad is a spiritual successor to Atari's Super Sprint. Like that title, this is a 4-player racing game with a kind of forced isometric perspective. It features many of the same gameplay principles as Atari's iconic title, including power-ups, money, multiplayer gameplay, race ceremonies, and the ability to upgrade your vehicle between races. But Super Offroad added features like ramps, hills, water holes, and barriers that make the races a bit more interesting. One of the biggest hits Sega have ever produced, Golden Axe went on to spawn a series of sequels that never quite managed to live up to the brilliance of the original. In Golden Axe you take control of a dwarf, barbarian, or Amazonian, and go on a quest to kill the evil Death Adder, who is responsible for the death of your family. The basic idea of the game is to kill the enemies and collect the magic. One unique feature is that the more magic potions you save up, the more effect it has when you use it. Without doubt, Golden Axe is one of the finest scrolling beat-em-ups ever to be released in the arcades. Anyone who frequented amusement arcades in the early 80s will remember Taito's classic Kicks, whilst others may recall the many conversions and clones for home machines. Ball Fight is a sequel to Kicks, and it upgrades everything from the original title whilst managing to retain the same addictive and compulsive gameplay. Like Kicks, the aim of the game is to claim a certain percentage of the screen by the way of drawing boxes, whilst avoiding the giant Kicks and his 2 sparks. But now the Kicks is no longer just a bunch of lines. He's now a giant animated beast that is themed to each unique level. Without doubt one of Capcom's biggest hits, Final Fight was originally supposed to be a sequel to the Street Fighter games, but soon became a game in its own right, and also went on to spawn several sequels of its own. It took the scrolling beat-em-up genre, made popular by Double Dragon, to a new level with its huge sprites, detailed backgrounds, and end-of-level bosses. Like the more famous one-on-one fighter, each character has their own individual moveset, that includes special moves and their own individual characteristics, a feature that really set it apart from previous scrolling beat-em-ups. Hard Driving is one of those arcade games that truly wowed audiences upon its release. With its solid 3D polygon graphics, realistic controls and use of action replays, it set several new standards that later became commonplace in all driving games. This was all housed in a big sit-down cabinet that looked a bit like a car, with a gearbox, wheels and everything. You have 2 courses to race around, the speed track with its barn and mooing cow, and the harder but more impressive stunt track, with its loop-de-loop and bridge jump. It's hard to exaggerate just how groundbreaking this was back in the day. For those of you that somehow missed out on the magic of the original Turtles arcade game, which was by far the hottest cabinet out there upon release, it was a scrolling beat 'em up for 1 to 4 players that featured all your favourite characters from the original cartoon. As well as being able to play as all 4 of the Turtles themselves, you got to fight against people like Rocksteady, Bebop, Baxter Stockman, Shredder, and eventually the evil Krang himself. Whilst the actual gameplay is fairly generic for the most part, it's the overall style and pure nostalgia that makes this one an all-time classic. And that rounds up my look at the greatest arcade games of 1989. Are there any others you can think of that should have made the list? Or do you disagree with any of the entries that I did include? I'd love to hear the thoughts in the comments. Before I go though, I must thank all of my loyal patrons who continue to support my channel and make videos like this possible. However, I must give special thanks to the following patrons in particular for their much appreciated pledges: Mitchell Valentino, Neptune, Seth A. Robinson, Carl Olsen, Aussie B, Dos Gamerman and Electron Star Collapse. If you also want to help support all my creative endeavours, including this YouTube channel, then please go and check out my Patreon right now. You can get access to hosts for extra content, including downloads, exclusive videos, creative insights, and much more besides. I've been the Lad, I thank you for watching, and I'll see you all again for another video very soon.